Imagine carrying the weight of a betrayal that robs you of peace and makes you seek revenge, believing that only then will you find justice. But what if true freedom didn't lie in making others suffer, but in freeing yourself from the rage that consumes you? Isabela's story will lead you on a path of pain, difficult choices, and a surprising revelation about the power of forgiveness. Prepare to discover how, sometimes, the greatest victory comes when we let go of anger and choose peace. Isabela never imagined that a simple gesture, a thoughtless word, could destroy the trust she had built over the years. The trust she believed was unbreakable. She was a strong woman, full of dreams, with a life brimming with expectations and plans for the future. Her eyes, which once reflected a hopeful glow, were now dull, as if the light that once lived within her had been extinguished in a painful and irreversible way. It all began on an ordinary afternoon, when nothing seemed different from the others. Isabela was at home, sitting on the couch, with a hot coffee in her hands and a peaceful mind. She was in the middle of a work break, reviewing some emails, when her phone vibrated on the table next to her. A message appeared on the screen, and as she read the words, a strange sensation took over her body. It was a message from a mutual friend, someone she trusted deeply, someone with whom she shared her greatest secrets and fears. What was written there, however, was something she never imagined she would hear. The message spoke of something Isabela couldn't believe, something so shocking it seemed impossible to believe. It was about Maria, a longtime friend with whom she had always shared her joys and sorrows. And what was being revealed in that message? That Maria, the friend she saw as a sister, was somehow involved with the person Isabela loved most. Her partner, the man she thought was her life partner. The shock was immediate. Isabela froze, the hot coffee now a distant memory, as her eyes were fixed on the screen, trying to process the words, trying to understand what was happening. She didn't want to believe it. Her mind began to make excuses, trying to justify what she had just read. But the more she tried to deny it, the clearer it became, like an image forming in the fog. Irrefutable, impossible to erase. The betrayal was there, before her, in the form of words that cut into her soul. And in that moment, something inside Isabela snapped. It was as if an invisible blade had pierced her chest, ripping apart all her beliefs about love, friendship, and the world she believed she lived in. She found herself overcome by a profound rage, a rage so overwhelming that it consumed every thought, every feeling. What to do in the face of something so treacherous? Trust, the strongest pillar of any relationship, had been brutally and mercilessly shattered. The minutes passed as if they were hours, and Isabela's mind was in turmoil. She felt as if she were being pulled into a spiral of conflicting emotions. She couldn't let this pass without a response. She couldn't allow this betrayal to go unpunished, without doing something to make the other person feel the pain she was feeling. Revenge. That was what her mind screamed. That was what she wanted. Her soul cried out for justice, but a justice that was even more impactful, more profound. Her pain needed to be felt, needed to be reflected somehow in the world, and she wasn't willing to be the only one suffering while everyone around her continued on with their lives, without even caring about what she was going through. The rage was unbearable. Every breath, every heartbeat seemed to fuel it more and more, as if life itself were a poison coursing through Isabela's veins. She couldn't imagine forgiveness or reconciliation at that moment. The idea of looking at Maria and her partner's betrayal and acting as if nothing had happened was to her an affront. It was the end of something precious, something she knew would never be the same again. Isabela's phone began to ring, but she couldn't answer it. Each time her partner's number appeared on the screen, her hatred grew. There was no room in her heart for explanations, no words to lessen the pain she felt. She wanted to scream, to run to the farthest place and leave everything behind. But at the same time, she wanted everyone to know what she was going through. The betrayal could not be hidden. nor disguised. She deserved justice, and that could only be achieved if the pain was reflected on those who caused it. The feeling of betrayal wasn't just about emotional infidelity. It wasn't just about the relationship between her partner and Maria. It was about the breaking of a bond, the destruction of a trust Isabela had carried with her for so long. She had always believed that the people around her would be trustworthy, that love would be unbreakable. But now, that ideal had been shattered, and all that remained was the deep emptiness of a broken trust. Isabela felt lost. What to do now? How to act? How to deal with this pain without losing herself in it? And most importantly, who would she be from that moment on? Anger began to become such an intense force that it seemed to take over her entire being. She knew she had to act. She knew she couldn't let this go unnoticed. Not while her life was being destroyed by what she had just discovered. But doubt slowly began to creep into her mind. Would revenge bring the peace she so desperately desired? Or in fact, would she only be digging herself a deeper hole? And so, with her heart broken and her mind aflame, Isabela found herself at a crossroads. What seemed like a natural reaction to grief, the search for revenge, could actually be the beginning of a journey of even greater destruction. Anger gripped Isabela in a way she never imagined possible. At first, she tried to control it, tried to hide it, as if it were something that could be smothered. With time, but the feeling that welled up inside her, like a growing flame, could not be ignored. She felt the heat of anger coursing through her veins, burning every thought, every decision, making everything around her increasingly unbearable. She woke every morning with the weight of betrayal on her chest, feeling as if she were carrying the entire world on her shoulders. The phone beside her felt like a monster, always vibrating, always with messages or calls from people she didn't even want to hear from. But what consumed her most wasn't the words of others, but the constant sound of her thoughts, repeating over and over like a mantra. They have to pay. They need to feel the pain I feel. They need to know what it's like to be betrayed, what it's like to be broken. In her mind, revenge became the only solution. It was like a drug. She could no longer think of anything else. The more she fed these thoughts, the further she withdrew from everything and everyone. Anger blinded her. She began to lose her patience over small things, with people who weren't even connected to her pain, but who somehow became targets of her emotional outburst. It was as if she were a storm, devastating everything in her path. Isabela distanced herself from her friends, from those who tried to reach out, even if only willingly. With each attempt at support, she felt their only desire was to be heard, but not in the way she needed. They didn't want her to seek revenge. They didn't want her to seek justice. They wanted her to move on. But how could she move on with her heart torn apart, her soul bruised by the most bitter betrayal she could ever have received? There was no way, and she didn't want to hear empty advice. Why is everyone trying to calm me down? They don't understand what I'm going through. They don't know the pain of being betrayed by someone you trusted with all your being. Anger fed on this. On every word of support that she felt was a disguised insult. On every look full of compassion, but which, to her, felt like cruel irony. Isabela could no longer distinguish between what was fair and what was an impulsive response to pain. What she wanted most was for the world to feel the weight of what she was experiencing. The little things began to irritate her unbearably. The noise of the city, the sound of people laughing around her. Everything seemed like a distant echo of a world that didn't understand her, that didn't share her pain. That's when she began to change. Without realizing it, her words became sharper, her gestures more impatient. At lunch with her coworkers, a simple joke about a failed project was enough to make her lose her temper. A simple, "Don't worry, it'll work out next time," was the trigger. Isabela couldn't take it anymore. She got up from the table with anger in her eyes, her voice raised and her heart racing. "You know nothing. You don't know what it's like to lose everything you have," she shouted, before running off, leaving everything behind. But the anger wouldn't stop. It followed her everywhere. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger, someone she no longer recognized. Her eyes were different, darker, more closed to the world. The reflection she saw there was no longer that of a strong, hopeful woman, but of someone plunged into a darkness that distanced her from everything that truly mattered. Every time she looked in the mirror, Isabela saw the anger reflected in her own face, as if she had become the very essence of what consumed her. Isabela could no longer see things clearly. Her decisions became impulsive. She began acting without thinking, simply to satisfy her thirst for revenge. She sought to know where he was, what he was doing, who he was with. Every piece of information about him, about Maria, felt like a sharp sword, a tool that helped her build the perfect scenario for whatever she felt she needed to do. Her nights were long, empty, and when she finally managed to sleep, her dreams were invaded by their figures, the traitors, appearing like shadows, provoking a hatred that wouldn't leave her alone. Even the small gestures, those she had previously considered simple and full of love, now seemed insignificant. Her partner, when he tried to talk to her, felt like a stranger. The "I love yous" he said no longer meant anything. Everything she heard felt empty, false. She could no longer trust him, and the anger transformed into something almost physical, a presence that occupied every inch of her being. Isabela realized, little by little, that anger was no longer letting her live. She couldn't find happiness in anything. The pleasure she once took in the small joys of everyday life was now overshadowed by a whirlwind of feelings that consumed her. Her body was tense, her mind overwhelmed, and her spirit more than ever felt broken. But she didn't know how to break out of this cycle. Anger was now ingrained in her being, shaping her actions, her words, and even her reactions. And the worst part was, she didn't want to break out, because deep down, she believed that only this could finally allow the pain she felt to be acknowledged. She felt that without revenge, without the painful response she felt she deserved, nothing would make sense anymore. What she didn't know was that, on this path of endless anger, she was losing something much greater: herself. Isabela was no longer in control. Every step she took seemed guided by an uncontrollable force, as if rage were her only compass, pointing her deeper and deeper into the abyss of revenge. No matter what was happening around her, what truly mattered was the weight of betrayal, the desire for them, Maria and her partner, to feel the same emptiness she carried. Life around her was crumbling, but for some reason, it made her feel alive, that something inside her still held power. The problem, however, was that Isabela's anger wasn't just affecting her decisions anymore. She was losing control of her own life, her own identity. Impulsiveness was taking over her, like a tide sweeping away everything in its path, without regard for the consequences. But the worst part wasn't what she was doing to others. It was what she was doing to herself. At work, she became a shadow of her former self. The meetings she once dominated with elegance and confidence were now just a backdrop to her feverish mind. Her boss, concerned about her performance, began asking questions. "Are you okay, Isabela?" he asked once, after she let slip a harsh, impatient comment in a meeting. She gave a forced smile, the smile everyone recognized as a mask she wore to hide the turmoil inside. But in reality, there was no longer room for the Isabela everyone knew. The only space she had now was one filled with pain, anger, and an obsession with revenge. That's when the messages started coming in more frequently. She knew he, her partner, was trying to reach her. Each ring on her phone made her heart race, not with anxiety or hope, but with the anger she felt. One night, unable to take it anymore, she answered his call. His voice on the other end was soft, apologizing, trying to explain, trying to make amends. But to Isabela, these were nothing more than empty words, lies in the form of sounds. "You have to pay. You have to feel what I felt," she thought, almost in a trance, as she listened to his words without really hearing them. Isabela didn't think about what she was doing. Anger blinded her, and she began to act impulsively. There was no reasoning. There was no reflection. Only the desire to see the world collapse around those who had hurt her. One night, she decided she had to go to him. It didn't matter where he was. It didn't matter what happened. She had to confront him. She had to make him understand the magnitude of the pain she felt. She dressed quickly, grabbed her bag, and left without saying a word to anyone. The street was deserted, the silence of the night contrasting with the chaos consuming her mind. Every step she took felt like the right decision. She no longer cared about the damage. By the time she reached his door, her heart was pounding. But at the same time, she felt a sense that she was finally in control, that her pain would be acknowledged. He opened the door, and before he could say a word, Isabela shoved him in, nearly knocking him over. She approached, anger visibly coursing through her hands shaking, but her eyes fixed on his face with a menacing gleam. He tried to explain, tried to apologize, but she wouldn't listen. She didn't want to hear anything else. She accused him, blamed him, in every way pain and hatred could muster. When he asked her to stop, to think about what she was doing, Isabela's response was an explosion. Think. You want me to think. You betrayed me. You destroyed me. Her voice came out in a scream that echoed through the room, as tears of anger and frustration began to mix with the fury in her eyes. She was so close to breaking down, but in that moment, she didn't want to be weak. She wanted to be strong. She wanted to make him see the pain he had caused. But the anger didn't stop there. Isabela knew what she had to do. It wasn't enough to just scream. It wasn't enough to just confront him. She needed him to suffer. She needed him to feel what she felt. That moment had turned into something much darker than she could have imagined. Without thinking about the consequences, she grabbed her phone and texted Maria, threatening to expose everything. Each word she typed was a dagger thrust deeper into her soul. But Isabela didn't care. It felt like a war from which there was no turning back. She needed to watch their world crumble. When the phone rang again, it was Maria. Without hesitation, Isabela answered, her voice sharp and devoid of empathy. I know what you did. And now, everyone will know. You won't get away with it, just like he won't. She hung up without giving her a chance to explain. This sense of control was palpable, but inside, something was breaking even more. Revenge wasn't bringing her the peace she imagined, but rather disfiguring her, making her lose herself in a sea of thoughtless decisions, in an ocean of pain that seemed endless. That night, when she returned home, Isabela didn't feel relieved. She felt empty, but there was no turning back now. Revenge was complete, at least in her mind. She had done what she thought was necessary, but deep down, a question arose, almost silent but powerful. Will this really heal the pain, or will it only make it grow worse? Isabela knew there was no stopping her. The quest for revenge had consumed her to such an extent that she saw no way out. She felt defeated, but at the same time, she harbored the illusion that her revenge was a victory. But what she didn't know was that the true price of this victory would be far higher than she could have imagined. With each passing day, Isabela felt the weight of her obsession. What began as a cry of pain transformed into a relentless force that pushed everything around her away. Her friendships, once a cornerstone of her life, began to slip away like sand through her fingers. Those who had once been willing to listen to her outbursts were now pulling away, uncomfortable with the whirlwind of rage that consumed her. She knew she was pushing people away, but she couldn't control it. Her mind was obsessed with a single goal: revenge. This became increasingly clear in her interactions. When she was with friends, she could no longer focus on other conversations. Instead of laughing at jokes and sharing stories, her thoughts were always focused on the next steps she would take against those who had betrayed her. Her words became sharp, her laughter rare, and the lightheartedness she once brought to any room was now replaced by a heavy, tense atmosphere. The worst part was when she began to notice the emptiness around her. At work, her colleagues began whispering, and quick conversations became uncomfortable when she entered the room. Text messages from friends became shorter and colder, and invitations to meetings and lunches disappeared. She knew they were avoiding her, but she couldn't understand why. She couldn't understand that, in her obsessive search for justice, she was sinking deeper into the shadows of her own pain. One day, during lunch with Clara, her longtime friend, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Clara, with a worried look, stared at her, trying to find words that wouldn't seem too harsh. "Isabela, I understand what you're going through, but you're wasting yourself. You're losing control. Anger, revenge, they won't heal you." Isabela felt the weight of Clara's words, but what she felt even more was the pain of rejection. This wasn't the friend she knew. Clara had always been someone who supported her unconditionally, and now she was saying Isabela was out of control. "You don't understand, Clara. You don't know what it's like to be betrayed by the one you love most." Isabela's response came with a force that made her realize her words no longer held the gentleness she once held. Clara looked at her sadly, and that was the last time they met. What began as a gentle pressure on the people who loved her soon became an invisible wall, pushing everyone around her away. She was alone, but that didn't worry her. In fact, the further she got away, the closer she felt to what truly mattered: revenge. She didn't need anyone else, not when her mind was fixed on one thing. Those who loved her, those who cared about her well-being, seemed more like obstacles than help. Opportunities also began to disappear. Work, once a source of pride and satisfaction, now seemed meaningless. She became increasingly impatient and distant, and her productivity plummeted. Her boss, who had always praised her dedication, now looked on with concern. The projects she had begun with such enthusiasm were now abandoned. Deadlines were missed, and Isabela seemed to be just waiting for things to fall apart. And it wasn't long before it actually happened. During an important meeting, where she was supposed to present a crucial project for the company, Isabela had an outburst. Her anger exploded in an exchange with a colleague who tried to question her decisions. She accused him of being superficial, of not understanding anything about what she was going through. All eyes turned to her, and the silence that followed was heavy, like a cold blade cutting through the air. She knew she had just ruined everything, but in that moment, it didn't matter. When her boss summoned her to a private meeting the next day, he didn't need to say much. His eyes, once friendly, were now cold. "Isabela, you're no longer focusing on what's important. We're concerned about your performance, and more importantly, your behavior. If you continue like this, we'll have to consider other options." The threat of being removed from her position, which had previously seemed impossible, now hung over her like a dark cloud. But still, she didn't care. Revenge, pain, anger, all of it dominated her being. As she returned home that night, she felt the heavy loneliness that now surrounded her. The emptiness was profound, and life seemed to have lost all meaning. She was sinking into a darkness of her own making. What had she achieved with her relentless pursuit of revenge? Nothing but a destroyed life. And the scariest thing was that, somehow, Isabela couldn't see herself leaving this path. She couldn't see how she could turn back, because in her mind, everything she was doing was justifiable. She was fighting for justice. And even though she had lost everything, friends, opportunities, her boss's trust, the one thing she knew, clearly, was that revenge was still the only fuel keeping her going. She was alone, but it didn't matter. Revenge had replaced love, friendship, hope. But as the weeks passed, and the world seemed to drift further apart, a silent doubt began to creep in. When she finally managed to make everyone pay, who would be left by her side to see the end of this story? She no longer knew how she could rebuild herself after so many losses, so many falls. What would be left of Isabela when all this was over? Isabela woke to a silent morning, the sun already shining through the closed curtains. but she still felt no light. The room was shrouded in shadows, as if the room itself reflected what she felt inside. She sat on the edge of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor, and for a moment, she didn't know what to do. The clock on the wall marked the beginning of another day, but to her, it felt like time had stopped. What had happened to her? Who had she become? Those questions began to hammer at her mind, in a way she could no longer ignore. The rage driving her was becoming unbearable, but there was something else, something deeper, that was slowly beginning to surface. A feeling of emptiness she could no longer hide. She stared into the mirror, as if searching for some answer in the lines of her face, in the shadows that marked her expression. Every time you looked at yourself, you saw someone different. She no longer recognized that woman who had made impulsive decisions, who had immersed herself in revenge without considering the damage she had caused, not only to others, but to herself. The reflection was almost a stranger. The woman she had seen in the mirror before, confident, kind, full of dreams, was now lost, consumed by a hatred that was consuming her from within. The anger no longer brought her the sense of power she had felt at first. Now, it left her feeling empty, disillusioned, directionless. Isabela stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. The world outside moved at its own pace, people coming and going, their lives flowing like an endless river. And she, standing there, felt completely disconnected from everything. The pain, which had once seemed the only thing that made sense, was now just a weight. She no longer wanted to live with that feeling, no longer wanted to carry her anger like a shield against the world. But at the same time, she didn't know how to let go. She didn't know how to move on. It was then that she remembered Clara. Her friend's face flashed in her mind, the last conversation they'd had, the last time someone had tried to tell her that anger was consuming her. Isabela closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to relive that moment. Clara had looked at her with such affection, but also with genuine concern. "You're destroying yourself, Isabela." Those words still echoed in her ears, and something inside her broke, as if she were finally seeing the truth. Clara wasn't wrong. She was destroying herself, and the worst part was, she knew it. But there was more. Something else she couldn't help. What she'd done to Maria, the confrontation with her partner, the phone calls, the threatening text, messages, none of it was satisfying anymore. The anger was turning into an internal pain that only grew. And deep down, Isabela knew she wasn't taking revenge on anyone. She was slowly destroying herself from within. She slumped on the couch, her mind spinning. Her feelings were so mixed, so conflicting, that clarity seemed impossible. There was a part of her that still wanted to believe it had all been worth it, that she could still get the justice she sought. But as the days passed, she realized this wasn't justice. It was revenge. And revenge, as sweet as it seemed at first, was leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. She didn't feel better. She felt empty. Fear began to well up in her chest. The fear that when it was all over, she would look back and see that, instead of regaining what she had lost, she had only created a deeper chasm. Isabela could no longer understand what was real. The pain of the betrayal that had brought her here no longer justified her. What was left now was a woman alone, consumed by a hatred she could no longer control. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. On the other end, Maria's timid voice seemed like an echo from a past she no longer wanted to relive. "Isabela, I know you're mad at me. I just wanted to apologize. I know there's no way to fix everything, but Isabela interrupted. Not because she wanted to be cruel, but because the word sorry no longer held the same weight for her. She was tired of fighting, tired of carrying anger. Her voice was softer, without the venom that had become habitual. "It's no use anymore, Maria. I know what happened. I know what you did. But the truth is, deep down, it's not you I want to hurt. It's myself. She hung up the phone without another word, feeling lighter, but also scared. The words that had come out of her mouth had been a reflection of what was really going on inside her. The anger no longer made sense. The desire for revenge no longer made sense. Isabela felt as if she were at a breaking point, where she no longer knew who she was. She no longer wanted to be the woman drowning in revenge. But what was left now? With a heavy sigh, she closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to feel the pain, not as a force pushing her forward, but as something she needed to face, to acknowledge. The pain was real. The betrayal was real. But the anger, the obsession, all of it was only making the pain last longer. Isabela slowly stood up, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a little closer to herself. She didn't know what to do next. She didn't know how she could possibly stop all of this. But one thing was clear in her mind. She no longer wanted to be a prisoner of her own anger. Something inside her was beginning to shift, like a seed being planted in the arid soil of her soul. She didn't yet know what it was, but she was beginning to realize that the real fight wasn't against others, it was against herself. And, as difficult as it was, the only way to move forward was to learn to let go of the anger. Isabela sat at the table, her gaze lost in the slowly cooling cup of coffee. Clara's words still echoed in her mind, but they were like distant echoes, almost drowned out by the internal storm that still consumed her. What did she want? Justice? Reparation? The thought of seeing her pain reflected in the eyes of Maria, her former partner, was what drove her to move forward, to resist the emptiness that was beginning to threaten her strength. But at the same time, an inner voice, albeit faint, told her that this would get her nowhere. She considered what to do next. The obsession with revenge that had consumed her for weeks was beginning to dissipate, but something even more powerful remained: the desire for justice. Not justice in the sense of the law, or even morality, but that sense of balance, of seeing those responsible for her pain touched in some way. Was this what she needed? To see them both pay for their betrayal? There was no longer any doubt. She still wanted them to feel what she felt. So she began to plan, not impulsively as before, but now with a cold, almost calculating feeling. With every step, she imagined the moments when she could finally expose the betrayal, every word she could use to destroy them, so they would know Isabela wouldn't let herself go unanswered. She thought of ways to do this, of how Maria and her ex-partner would have to face the consequences of their actions. Maybe it would be something simple, a message posted on social media, an anonymous email, something that would make clear to the entire world what had happened, how cruel they had been. She no longer cared what this would do to their lives. She just wanted them to feel somehow the weight of her pain. But as she formulated these ideas, something inside her began to question itself. A part of her, silent but growing, no longer believed this was what she needed. For a brief moment, she wondered what would happen next. And the answer frightened her. She would make them suffer, yes. But what then? Would she be satisfied? Would this truly bring peace to her soul? Would she feel like she had finally achieved some kind of reparation? Isabela picked up her phone, hesitated for a moment, and, on impulse, decided to text Maria. But as she typed the words, she stopped. What was she doing? What did she expect from this? Revenge is sweet, she had heard once. But now, if she were honest with herself, she felt no sweetness in her heart. The anger was still there, yes, but she began to realize that her relentless pursuit of justice was only trapping her in a vicious cycle. She wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, but deep down, she knew that this weight wouldn't change anything in her life, or in her heart. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't convince herself that this would make her feel better. In truth, what she was doing now was allowing herself to sink deeper into her own pain. If she went after them, if she truly made them pay for what they'd done, what would she gain from it? Temporary satisfaction? Maybe. But it wouldn't erase the feeling of emptiness that filled her. It wouldn't erase what she'd lost. It wouldn't erase the fact that with every attempt to get justice, she was only fueling her bitterness. And that's when the truth began to unfold before her. Her quest for reparations was just an excuse to continue harboring the pain. She believed that if she made them suffer, her pain would disappear. But that was a lie she was beginning to see clearly. What she truly needed wasn't revenge. What she truly needed was forgiveness, not just for others, but for herself. Forgiving herself for letting herself be consumed, for allowing anger to control her, for making impulsive choices that now took her further and further away from who she truly was. As she reflected on this, the weight of her actions began to weigh heavily on her. She knew that continuing on this path of revenge would keep her imprisoned. And the more she thought, the more she felt the weight of Clara's words, which now seemed to echo with an undeniable truth. You are destroying yourself. The anger, the desire for justice, the obsession with making amends for what had been done to her, all of it was becoming a deep hole that swallowed her, a cycle of suffering that knew no end. She needed to stop, not for their sake, but for her own. There was nothing others could do to repair the damage that had already been done. The only person who could still help heal her pain was herself. But even as Isabela began to understand this, the internal struggle didn't completely disappear. The temptation to seek justice was there, still vibrating in her mind, like a poison she couldn't quite exorcise. She didn't know how to take the next step. But one thing was becoming clear. Her quest for revenge would lead her nowhere but deeper into her own pain. And as hard as it was to admit, the only thing that could truly free her was to stop trying to make others suffer and start finding peace within herself. It was a gray, lifeless afternoon as Isabela walked aimlessly through the city streets. She had nowhere to go, and the feeling of being lost amidst so many people only grew. People passed her hurriedly, oblivious to the turmoil she carried inside. Her steps were slow, as if the weight of her own grief were greater than any physical distance she had to travel. It was a silent but crushing pain she could no longer ignore. It was then that she spotted the small bookstore to her right. It wasn't a place she usually frequented, but something about her, a vague, almost imperceptible feeling, drew her in. The sound of the bell ringing as the door opened felt like an invitation to something she couldn't quite grasp. The shelves were filled with old books, dusty, yet still, possessing a charm that drew her in. She walked to the self-help section, where she came across titles she'd never considered before. Something, however, made her stop before one book in particular. Forgiveness, The Key to Inner Freedom. It was a simple title, but to Isabela, it sounded like an answer to something she didn't even know she was searching for. The book felt like the only solid thing in a sea of uncertainty. Without much thought, she picked it up and walked to the counter to pay. As she turned to leave, someone called her name. A calm, comforting voice. You seem to be carrying the weight of the world, young lady. She looked back and saw an elderly man with white hair and a beard, and kind eyes that seemed to see more than just what was in front of him. He was standing near the window, as if waiting for someone. The familiarity of his face, as if she'd seen him somewhere before, made her stop. Sorry, Isabela said, trying to smile but unable to hide the sadness in her eyes. I'm just looking for something. The man smiled with a look of understanding. I understand. Sometimes we feel like we need to find something outside of ourselves to fill the void. But what you're truly searching for is inside you, just waiting to be found. Isabela felt a wave of confusion and frustration. I'm trying to figure out how to get over this. How to stop feeling so much anger, so much pain. I don't know what to do with this anymore. She paused, as if her words were an unexpected outburst. I thought revenge, justice was the solution. But now, nothing feels right. The man approached, gently taking the book she was holding. Forgiveness, he said calmly, is not about letting others do whatever they want. It's not an excuse for what they did. Forgiveness is for you. It's a release, not for the one who hurt you, but for the one who carries the pain inside. Isabela looked at him, skeptical but curious at the same time. Liberation? How can forgiveness free me if what happened was so unfair? He watched her patiently, as if he'd heard that same question 1,000 times. Because, my dear, anger, pain, revenge, they're like chains that bind you. You think you're doing something for others, but in reality, you're imprisoning yourself in a cycle of suffering that leads you nowhere. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about you. You choose it to free your own heart. Isabela felt a pang of something deep in her chest, as if it were the first time in weeks she had heard a truth that touched her soul. The anger that had driven her for so long now seemed fragile, about to shatter before a new perspective. But she was still lost. How could she forgive? How could she let go of the pain that consumed her? Forgiveness doesn't erase the pain, my dear. It doesn't erase what was done, but it gives you the chance to move forward, to stop punishing yourself, to stop imprisoning yourself. Make no mistake, it's not easy, but it's the only way to find peace. The man's words stuck in her mind like a seed. It wasn't a magical answer. It wasn't something that would solve everything at once. But there was something about the gentleness of that message that made her feel lighter. As if, somehow, she had taken the first step toward leaving the weight of anger behind. The man smiled, as if knowing he had just planted it there, with the right words at the right time. If you have the courage to try, the freedom you seek will be closer than you think. Forgiveness is an act of courage. It requires more strength than revenge. Only those who have the courage to free themselves from pain know what it means to be truly free. He turned back to the counter, and before Isabela could respond, he was already busy with another customer, as if the moment had ended. But for her, that was the turning point. Something in her mind and heart was beginning to shift. A painful but necessary process. The pain wouldn't disappear instantly, nor would the anger. But for the first time, she felt there was a way out. The key was right there, right in front of her, not in an act of revenge, but in the simple yet powerful act of forgiveness. When she left the bookstore, the crisp autumn wind felt lighter. The weight hadn't completely lifted, but Isabela already felt a small opening in her heart. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but she knew deep down that it was the only path that would lead her away from the prison of pain she had built for herself. And, with that thought, she took the first step toward the freedom she could barely imagine, but which was already within her reach. The sun was beginning to sink behind the horizon, tinting the sky with hues of orange and red. Isabela sat in her apartment on the balcony, looking down at the city, but unable to see anything. The distant lights of the streets and buildings seemed as distant as the peace she was beginning to seek. The book of forgiveness lay beside her, its cover slightly creased from days spent lying on the table. She hadn't finished it yet, but the words of the man in the bookstore, the message he had left her, continued to reverberate within her. Forgive. She repeated the word in her mind, as if trying to understand it from a new angle, something that had previously seemed incomprehensible. How could she forgive? How could she free herself from the anger that had, for so long, fed on the pain of betrayal? How could she do that when all she felt was a deep emptiness, a gaping wound she didn't know how to heal? The doubt was still strong. She was alone, but not because people had abandoned her. That wasn't it. She was alone because, until that moment, she had chosen solitude. Isabela had surrounded herself with walls so high, made of anger and resentment, that even she couldn't find a way out. When she looked back at what had happened to her, she saw only the scars of a battle that was no longer hers, but that still defined her. She remembered the moment she learned of the betrayal, the shock, the pain, and finally, the anger, as if a whirlwind had destroyed everything she believed secure, everything she thought she knew about love and friendship. And in that moment, she no longer wanted to know about love, friendship, or anything. She only wanted to make those who had hurt her feel the same pain. But as time passed, something changed. even if imperceptibly. Every time she thought about how her anger consumed her, she felt herself drifting further, away from the woman she used to be. It was as if she were losing pieces of herself along the way, pieces she might never get back. Isabela closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The cold wind coming through the window seemed to bring something new with it, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but somehow seemed exactly what she needed. Forgiveness. She had never thought of it as a form of liberation. She had always thought forgiveness was a sign of weakness, an invitation for the other person to hurt her again. But now, she was beginning to understand that forgiveness wasn't about others. It wasn't about the betrayal. It was about her. It was about finding a way to free herself, to let go of the anger, not because others deserved forgiveness, but because she deserved peace. Forgiveness didn't mean she would accept what had happened, forget, or magically disappear. No, it meant something much deeper. It meant she would no longer allow betrayal and anger to define her. It meant she would take control of her life, no longer letting the mistakes of others dictate the course of her journey. She would no longer have to carry the weight of anger, bitterness, and resentment. Isabela stood slowly, the decision taking shape within her. It was a small but profound step. She knew forgiveness would be a long process, not something that would happen overnight. But in that moment, she felt ready to take that step. Not to please others, not to go back and forget the pain, but to free herself. Because she knew, now, that living consumed by anger would only keep her trapped in the past, never allowing her the chance to start over. She picked up her phone, and with her hands trembling slightly, searched for Maria's number. The decision was simple, but the weight of the moment made the gesture charged with meaning. With a deep sigh, she typed the words she dreaded, but knew she needed to say. Maria, I know things can't go back to the way they were, and I don't expect you to understand me now, but I'm letting go of the anger, and forgiveness is something I need to move forward, not because you deserve it, but because I need it for myself. I hope that one day you too will find the peace I'm beginning to seek. She looked at the words one last time, and then, with a slight tug at her heart, pressed to send. The pain was still there, the wound still lingered, but something inside Isabela loosened, as if she had finally taken the first step toward freedom. She no longer had to carry the weight of revenge that was eating away at her. Forgiveness didn't erase the betrayal, but she now understood it was the key to freeing herself from a life driven by resentment and bitterness. Forgiveness didn't mean acceptance. It meant liberation. And that, in itself, was enough. She got up from the balcony and went to the window, looking out at the world. The sun had already set, but Isabela felt a new light within her, something gentle yet intense, beginning to replace the anger. A new beginning, a new chapter. The future was still uncertain, but now she knew she had the choice of how to move forward in her hands. Isabela didn't know what she expected, but the journey seemed more challenging every day. Forgiveness, that word that seemed so simple in theory, was proving to be something much more complex and painful in practice. She had taken the first step, with the message sent to Maria, and the feeling of lightness she felt as she held her hand to send it was brief. Soon, the anger and frustration returned, like a wave pulling her under. The message was made, but the feelings didn't dissipate so easily. Every time she passed the street that led to Maria's apartment, she felt a pressure in her chest. Maria's face, the words they had shared, it all came back with unexpected force. It wasn't just the betrayal, but the pain of loss. There was no longer the trust between them, no longer the same complicity she had thought unbreakable. And Isabela, even with forgiveness in mind, felt as if she were still being dragged to a place of revenge, a place of wanting the other to suffer. She woke in the morning, as always, with a feeling of anguish. The pain seemed to have stayed with her, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. She wanted to move on, but with each memory, with each flash of anger that arose, Isabela felt as if she were back where she started, as if she had never left that place of bitterness and pain. At work, things weren't easy either. The pressure to deliver projects was mounting, and the distance from her colleagues became clearer by the day. She felt isolated, as if her internal struggle was creating an invisible barrier between her and the rest of the world. She was torn apart, unable to focus on daily tasks, her mind constantly wandering to situations that had hurt her. Anger was still a part of her, and although she tried to control it, she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle of pain. It was one rainy afternoon, while walking down the street with her umbrella, that she encountered a familiar face. Her former college friend, Enrique, the only one with whom she still maintained sporadic contact, saw her from afar and waved, smiling amiably. He invited her to have coffee at a small cafe on the corner. Isabela hesitated. She was tired of the superficial conversation, the empty words. But at the same time, something inside her made her accept. The coffee was hot, and as they both settled into a table, Isabela felt a sense of welcome, something rare these days. Enrique, with his attentive gaze, noticed the anguish in Isabela's eyes, which she tried in vain to hide. "You seem to be at war with yourself," he said softly. "I know you're going through something difficult, but you don't have to carry it alone." Those words, simple and direct, came as a shock to Isabela. The last thing she wanted was to admit that she was still consumed by anger. But there, in front of Enrique, it was impossible to hide. The words came out of her mouth without her planning. I'm trying to forgive. I'm trying to let go. But every day, I feel the pain, the frustration. The anger won't go away. And somehow it seems like forgiveness only makes me feel weaker. Enrique was silent for a moment, watching her with a compassionate gaze. Forgiving doesn't mean being weak, Isabela. Quite the opposite. Forgiving is a courageous choice. You're not saying you're okay with what happened. You're saying you won't let it control your life. Those words stuck with her, but doubt still lingered. How could she look at Maria and the man she'd shared her life with for so long and simply let go? They didn't deserve forgiveness. Not for everything they'd done. The pain was too real. Wouldn't that be like moving on from it all, as if nothing had happened? Enrique continued, as if sensing she was still struggling to understand. "I know it's not easy. It's not something you solve all at once. Forgiveness is a process. But instead of carrying that anger, you're opening yourself to the possibility of feeling peace. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you." Isabela fell silent, feeling a mix of emotions. His words penetrated her deeply, but her mind was still full of contradictions. How could she truly let go of the pain and anger that had consumed her mind for so long? The following weeks were a silent struggle. Isabela was beginning to understand, but the path to forgiveness was arduous. When she sat alone in her apartment, in the silence of the night, the anger still lingered. She remembered the moments of betrayal and thought about how much it had destroyed a part of her. But slowly, something was beginning to shift within her. She still felt the pain, but she began to realize that every moment she spent harboring anger was a moment stolen from her own peace. She forced herself to continue. When thoughts of revenge arose, she warded them off with a simple reminder: "I am stronger than this. I am not a prisoner of pain." It was a daily exercise, a constant internal struggle, but something in her mind began to shift. Each step, no matter how small, brought her closer to what she truly wanted: peace. The feeling of finally being in control of her life, no longer defined by the betrayal that had destroyed her, but by the courage to move forward. One afternoon, after weeks of not contacting them, Isabela finally called her partner. His voice, still thick with regret, tried to explain, tried to justify. But Isabela, this time, was no longer searching for answers. She was, in some way, searching for herself. And hearing his words, she felt she needed nothing more. She no longer needed an explanation, nor a confession, nor an apology. She had something much more valuable, the right to move on. She hung up the phone, feeling a calm she hadn't felt in months. Forgiveness hadn't erased the pain, but it had created a window, a chance to breathe again. She knew that from now on, fighting her own anger would still be a daily battle. But for the first time, she felt prepared to face it. Isabela sat in front of the window, watching the soft light of dawn fill her apartment. The city outside seemed to be slowly waking up, as she was. For the first time in a long time, she felt calm. The anger that had consumed her for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet but profound peace. She could breathe freely, without the weight of revenge or resentment squeezing her heart. The path to get there wasn't easy. The pain, the tears, the moments of doubt, they were all part of the journey. But what she discovered at the end of her journey was something she never imagined possible. True freedom. Freedom doesn't come from making others suffer, nor from taking revenge. Freedom comes when you choose to free yourself from the pain that imprisons you, when you decide that anger, however justified, will no longer control your life. Isabela didn't forget the betrayal. She didn't erase what happened. Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting the other person's mistake, but rather letting go of the control that mistake had over her life. By forgiving, she didn't weaken herself, as she thought. She strengthened herself. She reclaimed herself. Today, she looks in the mirror and sees a different woman. No longer a woman defined by the pain of the past, but a woman who has chosen peace, who has chosen freedom. Forgiveness is not an act of weakness, but of courage. And it is this courage that has allowed her to find the peace she so desperately sought. Because in the end, true victory does not lie in making others suffer. True victory lies in making peace with yourself. If you're also on this journey, seeking to free yourself from pain and find peace, remember, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not for the sake of the person who hurt you, but for yourself, because you deserve peace, freedom, and a future unburdened by the whole past. If this story touched your heart, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to follow this journey of transformation and share this message with those you know who need to hear it. Peace begins within you. Let's find that peace together.